All right, so hopefully you can read this slide, and you are here to learn about ArcGIS Enterprise security, specifically security integration. And what we're going to be talking about today is really different types of authentications and some things like that. My name is Bill Major, with my colleague Jeff Smith. We both work for the ArcGIS Enterprise development team, and glad to be here this morning. So I would say let's try to save some questions till the end, but if you have a burning one along the way, raise your hand and we'll try to fit that in. Okay. This is the outline today. What we're going to focus on are different types of ArcGIS Enterprise authentication methods. And when we talk about authentication, we mean proving your identity via username and password, some type of single sign-on process, a PKI user certificate, or something like that. We're then going to dive into authorization through enterprise groups and the sharing model, and how you can incorporate groups from like Active Directory, LDAP, and more exciting SAML groups into your ArcGIS Enterprise. And at the end, anytime we talk about anything security, we just got to stress some basic secure communication with encryption via HTTPS. I know that could be a struggle for some of you, so we always try to cover that in some of these sessions as well. And just to be clear, we're talking about ArcGIS Enterprise. That means our on-premise software portal, ArcGIS server. This really doesn't cover anything related to ArcGIS Online, in case, just to be clear. All right, so let's talk about ArcGIS Enterprise authentication. Okay, so basically within the enterprise, you have, I don't know if it's fair to say, 3 types of authentication methods. At least that's how we're covering it today. But basically, you can authenticate at what we call the GIS tier. And what we mean at that, by that is you get to the portal login screen, and you log in at that point. That's what we're calling GIS tier. Those logins can either be built-in user account, which some of you may be very, just right out of the box, you start creating users with a portal users with a username and password. However, you can configure your ArcGIS Enterprise to use Active Directory logins as well as LDAP logins directly at that portal login screen. Many of you may know that, but there may be some of you that don't know that you can do that configuration as well. We're also then going to look at web tier, which basically means trying to achieve a single sign-on experience. So that logon process is then pushed to the web tier, like IIS or Apache and Tomcat, where you're maybe doing PKI certificates or integrating with an LDAP. So then you don't ever really get to that portal login screen. You're being automatically authenticated at the web tier, and it automatically signs you in to kind of create that single sign-on experience. And then we'll talk about SAML authentication, which one could argue is kind of GIS tier, or maybe it bleeds in between the two, but how you can set up your ArcGIS Enterprise to authenticate with a SAML provider, as well as something new at 10.6.1? 10.6, the incorporation of groups from that SAML provider as well. All right, so anytime you talk about authentication considerations, you just need to think about it a little bit. Where will, back up, who will be accessing your ArcGIS Enterprise? When you set this up, install, and configure it, who do you envision using it? Will it be people mostly inside the firewall, maybe some people outside the firewall? I'm not saying like there's a correct answer to any of these questions here, but these are things that you should take into account when you decide what type of authentication you put in place. From where will the users be accessing ArcGIS Enterprise? Will they be mostly in the office, on the network? Do you want access from outside your firewall via DMZ? Will people be accessing it from mobile devices or VPN? Not that all those situations change the answer, but they could. So it's just something to be aware of as well. And where is your ArcGIS Enterprise deployed? If it's inside the firewall, like on your internal network, then users have to be able to get to that network in order to access the enterprise. If you deploy it outside the firewall in a DMZ, then that opens it up, but then that brings along additional questions. Like if it's in the DMZ, you may not have access to your internal Active Directory in order to establish Active Directory logins. So these are all things that you need to kind of think about as you set up and choose a authentication method. All right, so let's first talk a little bit about GIS tier authentication. So remember what I said there is that's logging into your portal and getting to the portal login screen. So you're at the portal login screen, and you have to type in some type of username and password. Okay. GIS tier authentication, you can use actually both a combination of built-in accounts and enterprise users. Some of you may not be aware of that in this scenario. So I can actually integrate, set up my portal, for example. I could create a number of built-in accounts manually like I normally would, like go to add members and create usernames and passwords. But I could also configure portal at that point to use Active Directory logins as well. So when you come into the portal login page and provide a username and password, it actually will support either Active Directory user accounts or built-in user accounts. So that is a possibility. So what that means is it opens up to perhaps logins for your internal users, but also perhaps you create some special accounts for people that may not have Active Directory accounts for some reason. And of course, I say a lot Active Directory. This also can apply to an LDAP scenario as well. Both are supported. Basically, the way you do this, and I'm going to show you an example. I'll just show you how this is configured in a demo in a few slides here. You basically configure what we call the identity store. So how many people are portal administrators here? You'll call yourself a portal administrator. Okay. So when I say portal admin, I'm talking about going to /portal/portal admin, right? That login screen. And there you can actually get to the security config where you can modify what we call the identity store. Another thing about anytime you're configuring with enterprise identity stores is, do you want users to be automatically added or not? Okay. So if a user comes in and they type in a Active Directory username and password, and it's a correct username and password, and they haven't been to that portal before, do you want that process to automatically create them an account at that time? Okay. You may not want that. You may want people to send an email to get special permission or something like that. You may have a process before you can access my portal. You need, to request or something like that. Or you can just set it up to be automatic. So anyone that logs in within your organization automatically gets logged in. It creates an account. Maybe by default, everyone is a level 1 user, and they automatically have access and are happy from that point. Okay, so that's just a setting that we'll take a look at as well. The one thing with GIS tier authentication is that users have to get past the web server with no problem. Okay, we're not talking about any type of web server, web tier authentication at the moment. So in this scenario, they got to be able to get directly to that portal login screen, free and clear from a web server perspective. LDAP is I forget exactly what it's lightweight directory access protocol. It's typically a identity store in sort of non-Windows environments. If you're in a Windows environment, most everyone's using Active Directory. Not everyone uses Windows. I'm a Linux guy, so typically on other types of environments, it's just a different type of identity store. All right, so just a few slides. I always have a slide just to have some screen captures in case everything goes south on the demo. But I'll show you this. In Portal Admin, I talked about the ability to automatically create an account or not. I had that setting there highlighted. When you install Portal initially, that is set to false. Okay? So if you want accounts to be automatically created as people try to log in, you need to set that to true. Setting that to true, just be aware you need to bounce portal after that process restarted. All right. The next step is then setting up some credentials in what we call the identity store. So you basically tell portal, hey, I need to talk to Active Directory with some user account there. And of course it's encrypted, the password here, so you know, no need to copy that and try to go hack it or anything. But basically, portal is now going to try to talk to Active Directory so that when someone tries to log in, hey, is this a valid set of credentials? And if so, get their account information and create a portal account for me. And then the final step, as I mentioned, is in this scenario, we're assuming that this is a screen capture of IIS Manager, that anonymous authentication is set to true. So everyone can get through the web server with no problem in this scenario. All right. So why would you use GIS tier authentication? I wouldn't say this is a very common scenario, but it could be. One reason may be, like I mentioned earlier, you have portal behind the firewall, but maybe you want users to access it from the open internet or some type of scenario, and your web server and web adapter may be in a DMZ for some reason. And due to security reasons, you may not have access at the web tier, at the web server, to be able to really access internal Active Directory users for like a single sign-on experience. So this may, this may be a scenario where you would actually decide to use GIS tier authentication. One thing is you may want to have a scenario that enables both enterprise and built-in logins, like I mentioned earlier. And if you want that scenario, that could be a reason. And there may be other reasons, and I'm not going to get into it here, but I would encourage, just from a good to know, come see Jeff or I at the ArcGIS Enterprise Security Island. And if there are other reasons why you think you may need to use this scenario, it would be just good to let us know, just so that we better understand your requirements and things like that. All right, so I'm going to take just a couple minutes here. Am I running long? I'm trying to stay on track here a little bit. All right, so I know I showed you a slide of it, but I'm just going to show you basically the same thing. I don't need that up for sure. All right, so right now you can see that I have a portal running. Hopefully everyone can see it in the back. And basically this is currently set up to be GIS tier authentication. So I have gotten to the portal login page, okay? Now, just to be clear, to go look at portal admin of this server, you can see that I have set enable automatic account creation to true, okay? By default, as I mentioned earlier, this is false. So I've set it to true. And then more importantly, I've changed the identity store here. Oh, great. Let me, I've changed the identity store here. By default, it says something like built-in or something like that, if you've ever seen this. But I have updated this to be properly configured to talk to Active Directory. And what this will do is when someone tries to log in, Portal is smart enough to say, hey, first, is this a built-in account? Let me check that first. But if not, let me go check Active Directory to see if that user exists there. And if so, then it logs them in. So this is the configuration of talking to Active Directory. And you may say, well, how in the world, if I wanted to do this myself, do I know exactly how to set this up? Well, that's where our help documentation comes into play. We have this very well documented. I believe you can even click on this API reference. And if you go to security and update identity store, we even have samples in here as well of the exact JSON syntax of how to make that happen within your portal. Okay? So rely on the help documentation to get this right.
Can you go back to that screen? Just go one second.
This guy?
Yeah.
Okay. Of course, if you go to the help document out on the open internet under is it enterprise.arcgis.com, it will look different, but you'll get to a very similar help documentation on this subject as well. All right, so I have everything set up right, and then I can log in here with my account or even some domain account, super secret passwords here, And I can,
That's right. Try it again. Let me.
I'll try it again.
Yeah.
All right, maybe I didn't do it quite right. Okay, so because I supplied a domain /user and its password, it checked it against Active Directory. It said, okay, that user exists. I've already done this, already had an account created here, and sure enough, I have an account created here in Portal as well. So now I can belong to groups and lots of things like that. Now, for some of you security people conscious out there that may not know this, some people are like, well, how are you storing people's Active Directory's passwords when you do this? And actually, anytime you integrate with a enterprise identity store, we actually don't store any passwords at all within Portal. All that's done on the fly to check against the identity store at that time, and in those scenarios, nobody's password is stored in the Portal infrastructure. How's everyone feel about that? Pretty good? Still awake? All right. All right, so that's just a review of what we talk about as GIS tier authentication. Now we're going to take this next step further, because most people will want to, when they're integrating with LDAP or Active Directory, they want a single sign-on experience, right? That's like, I don't want to have to go start entering my passwords in 27 different places. I just want to log into my workstation in the morning and just go wherever I want to, and it just knows who I am. So that's what we call web tier authentication. So in web tier authentication, the authentication of the user is not necessarily done by Portal. It's pushed out to the web server tier, meaning that IIS, for example, in a Windows environment, is now going to handle that authentication. You could almost think that the Esri pieces of the technology is removed out of the equation at that point. We basically say, hey, IIS, we want you to authenticate users, and if they authenticate successfully, we'll know, the web adapter and Portal will know at that point that you have been authenticated correctly, and it will create sort of this single sign-on experience within the Portal framework. If most of your users are on an intranet or all going to be, all are Active Directory users, this may be a preferred mechanism just to achieve that single sign-on. And this supports both Active Directory username and passwords, but also for users out there that use PKI or some type of PIV card or CAT card if you're a military personnel. Those can be used to authenticate against Active Directory and authenticate you as well. Anybody using PIV cards, smart cards to authenticate in their environment? Not many, handful of people. Okay, just curious.
Can this method handle both the SSO through IIS and internal Portal users?
Okay, so that's a great question, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff. In a web tier authentication scenario, the question was, does this still support Active Directory and built-in users, I think is what your question was. In this scenario, the answer is no. Because what's happening at this point is the web server is authenticating the user. So a user has to get past the web server, and in that scenario, it's automatically going to log that user in. So there's not going to be a chance for the user to really provide a username and password at that Portal login screen. In a typical scenario, you would set up SSO, you would authenticate, and it would just pass you through and automatically log you in. Yes, sir?
Is that because in this situation, anonymous access is disabled on IIS?
Yes. Yeah. In our supported configuration, which we'll get to in a minute, you now disable anonymous access at the web tier and enable Windows authentication. So a user has to be able to get past the web server in this scenario for this to work correctly. Okay? And that can be either just IIS authentication with the username and password, or like I said, a CAT card or PIV card, smart card. Some users have those, and that's used to authenticate versus an actual username and password.
Are the smart cards the only other second authentication method that is allowed? Like, for example, to access our VDI, you put in your username and password, but we also send an SMS code texted to your phone.
Do we do MFA in Portal yet?
Not in Portal. That's only done through SAML authentication. You can.
Okay.
I'll talk about that when we get to SAML.
Yep. So how do you do this? Configure it. Actually, you basically configure it the same way I showed you a while ago on the back end with Portal. You set up the identity store to talk to Active Directory. You determine if users will automatically be added or not. But the final step in this is you change the Windows authentication on the web adapter for Portal. So by default, that's it. It's anonymous. Now you disable anonymous and enable Windows authentication. And then if a user can get through, life is good. Okay. Also, what we highly recommend, we say it's a requirement and you should do this, is enable all SSL on your portal in these scenarios, okay? That way all traffic is encrypted, which we'll talk about a little bit more at the end of the presentation, but also it prevents scenarios where it may prompt you for credentials twice in a HTTPS versus HTTP scenario, which you really don't want. So in our documentation, you'll run across this when you do web tier that you should enable that SSL checkbox in your portal so everything is secure and encrypted. All right, so working with the same portal, we're just going to do a little quick change here. I have a virtual machine here which is running this portal instance. So everything with the portal is still the same, which I showed you a while ago. So the one difference here is I'm going to come to the Portal web adapter. Hopefully you can see this in the back well enough. I'm going to go to Authentication, and I'm going to now enable Windows authentication and disable anonymous. All right, so now IIS is going to make sure I authenticate at the Active Directory tier before I even ever get to any Esri technology. So the web server is now handling this authentication. All right, I really don't have to do anything more at this point. So I'm going to open up my web browser. Anytime I make a change like this, I'm a big fan of clearing your cache, make sure you don't have any side effects. I am going to come over here and copy my URL so I don't fat finger that. So I'm going to come back. Now, you will see that I am being challenged, right? Now, and depending on how you have IE and secure zones and trusted zones set up on your network, you may or may not get this prompt. A lot of people within the security settings of Microsoft, you say, hey, anything that's .esri.com, for example, make that secure and on the intranet, and you won't be challenged for this. It will just pass through your currently logged in Windows credentials. I didn't really set that up here. But here, what I'm going to do is now I'm going to log in with my Active Directory credentials. Okay? Now, IIS did that, not me. I mean, not me. Not Portal in this case. So what happens in this case is IIS says, okay, that user's good. The web adapter then says, oh, something has happened at the web tier, so that user has been authenticated. So I'm going to do a little something special to let Portal know that we're now doing web tier authentication. And then Portal recognizes that and it's like, oh, something's happened at the web tier. I don't really care what happened at the web tier, but I'm being told that the user successfully authenticated. So I'm going to use that information passed to me to create this single sign-on experience at this Portal environment, at the Portal tier, and then create the account if I need to, and then go from there. So that's all there. Yes, sir.
Are there any plans to go up to the top where you're at demo and switch account to a built-in account after you've authenticated to the web tier?
I don't believe there are any plans to do something like that. Yes, sir. Be curious to understand maybe why, if you just want to get with us afterwards.
Yeah, well.
Okay, sure. Okay, so I mean, I know that's a quick little demo there, but that's just, it's within IIS. Typically, if you're in Linux, it may not be quite that easy. There's a few more configuration files and some things that you may need to set up, but it's quite simple to do in a Windows environment. All right, so let's move on. Make sure Jeff has plenty of time. We also support PKI web tier authentication as well, which can work with Active Directory or LDAP. In this case, with PKI, you're using user certificates. We're going to talk about certificates a little bit later. If you don't know what they are, don't worry about it too much right now. And typically, just one more thing, this isn't related to PKI. In web tier authentication, there's a setting to disable creating new built-in accounts. You typically want to disable that specifically so that users don't accidentally click around and actually maybe get to some login screen or some create new account screen. So there is a way to totally disable that so there's no chance of users ever actually seeing the create new screen. All right, so I'm going to turn it over for a while to Jeff to talk about some SAML integration.
All right. Thanks, Bill. Can you all hear me all right in the back? Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to talk about some SAML integration here. Let's see. Okay. First of all, for SAML integration, well, Bill has already discussed and demonstrated two different authentication methods, the GIS tier and the web tier, and sort of some of the pros and cons of each of those methods. Another method that I want to discuss is the SAML authentication. Now, this is ideal for organizations that already have a SAML identity provider configured. Some common ones are, for Microsoft, is ADFS. There's some other better known ones like Shibboleth is a common one, NetIQ. There are some various ones out there that your organization may already have configured, and if that's the case, it makes it a little bit easier for you to configure and use that authentication with ArcGIS Enterprise. It provides you a little more flexibility with the username format. I'll demonstrate that when I configure the SAML, what I'm talking about there. Regarding the multi-factor authentication, you can configure your SAML identity provider to use the multi-factor authentication. ArcGIS for Enterprise does not support that directly itself. So using the web tier authentication that Bill had demonstrated, there's not a way to tell it to use or tell it, I want to use multi-factor authentication. But with SAML, you can do that. Also, it supports, similar to the GIS tier authentication, it supports both built-in users and enterprise users. And like Bill described earlier, it's ideal if you've got some users that are not part of your Active Directory. Maybe they're contractors, maybe they're temporary users, but you want to give them access to your ArcGIS Enterprise. This is a method of doing that, creating a built-in account and let them log in. And again, we started supporting enterprise groups in SAML in 10.6. Now, we've supported enterprise groups for a while, and I'm going to demonstrate sort of a combination here, because I want to talk about the enterprise groups for web tier and GIS tier authentication. But I also want to talk about them related to SAML, and so I'm going to my demonstration is going to show both the SAML configuration along with enterprise groups. So I hope I don't want to confuse everyone with combining the two, but I'm just going to give you a heads up. So how does SAML, it's a conceptual workflow of how SAML works. You've got your client is your browser in the middle, and your ArcGIS Enterprise on one side, your identity provider on the other. The very first, when the browser, you attempt to log into your ArcGIS Enterprise, you go on, access that URL, and Enterprise responds and says, okay, you need to authenticate against another URL, and it redirects you to the identity provider. On the identity provider, this is where you would log in. It could be, like I said before, it could be a web tier authentication on the identity provider. It could be multi-factor authentication, CAC card, different things are supported there. And then the identity provider sends a SAML response back to the browser, and this is passed on to the ArcGIS Enterprise. And this is how, it's a bunch of encrypted information, but included in there is the username, the email address, the user's display name or given name, and that's about it. But the portal is able to authenticate, or excuse me, is able to verify that response and say, yes, I recognize the response that's being sent back, and then I can pull out the username and I can authenticate the user, and we can carry on. Now, a couple of key things to point out here is the ArcGIS Enterprise does not need to have direct communication with the identity provider. This is a big difference from with the GIS tier and the web tier that Bill had been describing, is that in those cases, ArcGIS Enterprise must be able to communicate directly with Active Directory or LDAP or another identity provider. In this case, it doesn't have to. Where this is advantageous is perhaps your ArcGIS Enterprise is in the cloud, and you log in, your client's out maybe on your internal network, and you access ArcGIS Enterprise in the cloud. It gets redirected to your identity provider that's maybe on your local network, and that will work fine. And so the communication between ArcGIS Enterprise and the cloud, the authentication just goes through the browser. It doesn't have to communicate directly with the identity provider in that sense. So, how do you do this? Again, I've got a couple of screenshots here. I'm going to demonstrate this in just a little bit, but you log on as an administrator to your ArcGIS Enterprise, go to My Organization and Security, and under the enterprise login via SAML, you need to do 2 steps here. You've got to set the enterprise logon, which I've got a screenshot right here where you enter all the information on the right-hand side. And then you also need to generate an XML or a metadata file to pass to the identity provider. So it understands who's going to be, which application is going to be authenticating users. And I'll show you that here in just a moment. So once you've configured that, then your login screen will look like this. When you sign out and sign back in, you've got an option to log in with either your enterprise account or your ArcGIS account. By ArcGIS, that's a built-in account. That's great. And you do have the option if you want to make it so just users, excuse me, let me back up. If you want to restrict it so just enterprise users can log in, and you don't want to have that button in there for built-in accounts, you can do that as well. That is in the one of the options in the configurations. So when you click on the enterprise button, you get redirected to a login screen by your identity provider. You log in there, and then you get transferred back over to your ArcGIS Enterprise. Now, I will show you a demo of this, but first, I want to talk a little bit about enterprise groups. And like I said, I'm going to combine, in the demo, I'm going to demonstrate both of them. So I want to talk about enterprise groups. So, why would you want to use enterprise groups? Well, first of all, what are enterprise groups? As many of you that are familiar with ArcGIS Enterprise, you can create groups within your portal, and you can assign users, any of your users you can assign to those groups. Now, as your organization grows, or perhaps you have a large number of users, it gets a little difficult to administer, I'll put it that way. If you've got a large number of groups, large number of users, and you're trying to maintain who's a member of what group and who should be pulled out, maybe they move on to a different department or anything like that, that can be tough to maintain. So what we've introduced, and we introduced this in 10.3.1, if I'm not mistaken, is the ability to link your portal group to an enterprise group. And so that allows your users, Portal will be able to determine which enterprise users should be a member of that group automatically. It'll query out to the Active Directory and say, okay, this user is a member of group A. Okay, I'm going to add them into this portal group for that reason. And then maybe you go on to some other users and try to determine whether they should be added to the group, removed to the group, or left as is. As I've got up here, it supports scalability really well. reduces some administrative maintenance, and it takes advantage of groups that your IT department has already configured and already maintaining in Active Directory. If they're doing the work to control which users are members of that group, you don't have to redo that work. So, like I said, previous releases for enterprise groups required the direct communication with Active Directory or LDAP. Starting in 10.6, SAML groups are supported. So with SAML groups, the group membership is actually passed down inside the SAML assertion, or the communication that's passed back to the browser and back to Portal. So how do you link a Portal group to an enterprise group? When you create a group, if you've configured your ArcGIS portal to use enterprise groups, you'll have an option up here when you create a new Portal group under who can join this group. You've got the option members of an enterprise group, and then within that you'll have to type in the domain and the group name. It's not case sensitive, but you do need to type it in. You can't do a search for it. Now, I'm going to show you this right now. Let's get here. Let's expand this. Okay, so right now I've got my portal is configured with just built-in users, no enterprise users. So I'm going to log in as an administrator, and I want to first configure this to support SAML users. So I'm already under Organization, Edit Settings, and I go down to Security, and I scroll down, and under here's the enterprise logins via SAML, and we do this. The screen that I've got up here is 10.6.1, which is about to be released later this month. One of the new options in here for SAML is you can have one identity provider or a federation of identity providers. This is brand new in 10.6.1 and would be particularly useful perhaps for some universities, but I'm not going to go into any details about that in this presentation. But I'm going to leave it on one identity provider, and I'm going to click Set Enterprise Logon. I will give it a name here. And I can choose whether I want the users who are logging in to be able to join automatically or after I add them. This is very similar to what Bill demonstrated earlier for the automatic account creation. So I'm going to have the users added automatically as I log in. And the metadata for the enterprise identity provider, you can have it as an XML file. If you really wanted to specify all the parameters, you could. But the easiest way is to use a URL. And I've got a copy of that URL here. Oops. So I'm just going to paste the URL in there. And under Advanced Settings, this is particularly helpful. Some different identity providers need to expect some of the requests or assertions to be signed, and this is in the documentation for your identity provider that you're using. Any of these advanced settings that need to be selected. I'm using ADFS in this case, so I'm going to enable signed requests. I'm going to check propagate logout to the identity provider. Now, this last option here again is new in 10.6, enable SAML-based group membership. And I'm going to check that as well. And everything else looks good. So I'll set the identity provider. Now, the portal is ready for it. The last step I need to do is to tell the identity provider, ADFS in this case, information about this portal. So if I click on Get Service Provider, it will generate a metadata .xml file that I can save and take over there. Fortunately, I've already got a copy of it. I'll save it anyways. And now I've got I'm going to remote desktop into my machine where I have ADFS installed. Now let me open up my ADFS management, and under trust relationships, relay and party trusts, I can right click on this and add a relay and party trust. And it takes me through a wizard here. The data source, this is where I want to select the metadata file that I just exported from my portal. So I'm going to browse to it on my desktop and hit next. I need to give it a name here. Let's do it. Now here is where I'm using ADFS 3.0 here, and here is where I could configure multi-factor authentication if I wanted to. In this case, I'm going to select not to do that. And you can also permit all users by default or deny all users by default if you wanted to. I'm going to leave it so all users can log in by default. And accept the defaults here. Now, the last step I need to do here is create a rule to determine which attributes are passed during the SAML authentication. So this is, I apologize, this is getting into some deep level details on ADFS, and I know you probably didn't come here to learn about ADFS, but I thought for some of you this might be beneficial. So bear with me here. The claim rule name is default. Attribute store, there's only one, Active Directory. Now this is where we map the Active Directory attributes to the SAML attributes that are going to be passed into Portal. And in this case, I want my usernames to be based on this user principal name down here. So I'm going to select that, and that's going to come over as the name ID. And we do have this stuff in our help documentation. So I'm going to select the display name to map to the given name. And I need to pass along the email address. And one more attribute that I'm going to pass is the groups. Now you've got a couple of group options down here. The one I'm going to show you here is the token groups qualified by domain name. And I'll explain what I mean by that when I demonstrate the enterprise groups. I'm going to link this to, where's group? There we are. Okay, so we're ready here on ADFS. We click finish, and we can click apply and OK, and we're done. So that's what we just added right there. So if I go back to my machine now, I'm going to minimize this. Go back to my machine. I'm going to log out and sign in. Now I've got two options here. I'm going to select Enterprise, and I get redirected. Now this URL at the top matches the ADFS URL that I just input. I get redirected there, and I can log in with I'll use the same demo account. I sign in, and there's my username, and I'm signed in now as a SAML user. So I'm going to sign out here and sign back in as the administrator and show you one more thing. We talked about groups. So let me go to my groups now. And I want to create a new group. And let's be creative here with a name. Just call it Role 2. I'm going to scroll down. Now under who can join this group, notice we've got four bullets in there. And the third one is members of an enterprise group. So when I select that, here I have to type in the enterprise group name. Now this, it's not case sensitive, but it needs to match the group name exactly. So in this case, my group is Esri /AGS role 2. Like that. Now I don't have an option to search for the group name. You have to know the group name. I'll demonstrate on one of Bill's machines with web tier authentication where you can actually search for it. But in this case, I create the group. And right now, it's a brand new group linked to an enterprise account, and there are no members in it yet. If I click back on my organization, the only enterprise user I have in here is the demo account, and the demo is not a member of that group. But if I log out and sign in as another enterprise user, a little different account. I signed in, and now this is a brand new user. It was just created. We enabled the automatic account creation. When I click on groups, notice this user is already a member of this role 2 group that I just created. So that's how the SAML enterprise group membership would work for you. So let me show you.
Quick question, Jeff. I have a question is, when you configure SAML groups, do all the users' groups get passed through as part of that insertion during the login process? Is that the way it works? Okay.
That's the way. During the when the user logs in, the groups, all the list of all the groups gets passed in. Question? Yes.
Is it only with SAML or also with Active Directory users?
It is with Active Directory. The question was whether this is only for SAML. I'm going to demonstrate right now with Active Directory users because you can do the same thing there.
And is there a synchronization between the members of the groups in the Active Directory and in the portal? If a user leaves the company, will it be deleted from the portal group?
What would happen the next time the user logs in, it would get refreshed automatically. So if the user were to log in again, they would get removed from the group. If they were removed from the group at the Active Directory level, the next time the user logs in, they get removed from the portal group. Now, if the user is removed from the Active Directory completely, no. The user it's an orphaned member. Yeah. Question? Yes?
With this in group, can you also then link that to those new enterprise sites so that they add automatically to that group and then just see that enterprise site? The microsites that they were talking about yesterday?
We don't have the ability to work with the sites in this case. I mean, the security behind what you can access in the sites is still there. And when you add a group, the users, the members that are a part of that group will be controlled by this. But it doesn't apply directly to the sites.
Even if you use ADFS to try to, so let's say let's say your gas company, you want to provide a portal to the water department. If we set up ADFS, would that be supported in this? Using sites and group memberships pretty much to have a directed content for the water department, which would be separate.
Yeah, and we can discuss a little bit more in detail after this. Let me continue on with my demonstration here, so I can let Bill finish up. Let me go under. So I'm logging into the portal that Bill demonstrated with earlier here. And hopefully it's up and running.
It is.
It's just taking its time. I don't know why.
Do you have ArcGIS Monitor?
Let me try to refresh this. There we are. Okay, so now we saw earlier, Bill already configured this with web tier authentication. So I logged in as an administrator. So now when I go to create a new group here, let's do a role 1 this time. Now I see the same button down here, members of an enterprise group, but notice since these are Active Directory users here, we're not using SAML users, I've got the ability to search for the group. And so I like my AGS role. I'll start typing AGS and just click on search for group, and I'll get a window here, and I'll actually be able to scroll and actually search for and select the exact group that I want.
That's awesome.
So now I've selected the group, and I click create group here. And when I go out, let me log out of this. I need to clear my cache. And let me log in as a different user. And now, when I click on this user account was just created. When I click on groups, come on, finish.
No sluggish.
You can do it. I know you can. You've got it in you. Try. There we are. When I click on groups, I'm automatically assigned to that role 1 group that I just created. So now I'm going to pass this back on.
That's a good demo, right? It actually works. That's all good.
I want to pass this back to Bill and let him finish off with some of the HTTPS encryption.
Like I said, these are just hold on, let me put this in my collar here. These are just a handful of slides to stress just a few points about security and encrypted communication. Really not going to do a demo here, but it is some information that we like to stress in these sessions. So how many people have dealt with SSL issues of some sort? Wow, look at that. Everybody? Is there anybody here that doesn't have SSL issues? All right, wow, that's all right, so what is a certificate? You hear this term SSL, right? And you're like, certificates, I don't know what it is. All right, so a certificate looks like that, right? Is that useful? No. I don't know if anyone's ever actually tried to open a certificate like a CRT file or a CER. It's actually a base 64 encoded file. You can open it in a text editor and look at it. That's what it is, all right? Well, that's not very useful, right? But that information is a cryptographic identity, and these identities can represent you, the person, but more importantly, with ArcGIS Enterprise, it represents the server URL, the server machine, and how they communicate with each other. Anytime you're going over a SSL port, it's using a certificate of some sorts, okay? 443, 6443, 7443, 2443. You've seen these ports within the ArcGIS Enterprise stack. They're using a certificate some kind of way for that SSL communication. This identity, think of it, we try to explain it a lot, as your driver's license, right? If I walk up to you and just write my name on a piece of paper, you're probably not going to accept that as my real identity, right? Because I could have written down anything. And that's kind of what like a self-signed cert is. It's generated based on just not being signed by an authority. But a properly signed certificate is much like your driver's license that the state issues you. It has some serial number. It's got specific information about when it expires and some information like that. So that's kind of, if you want to relate it to something real, what a certificate is about. In that certificate, it has your common, what we call a common name, your CN. And that is like your first name and last name, for example, in your driver's license. But in the world of computers, it actually is the name of a server. But more importantly, It's the URL, in the case here, what we're going to talk about, the URL by which that server is accessed. Okay? Many of you, the name of your server and the URL by which you access it probably aren't the same. You have DNS aliases and other things going on. When you create a certificate for users to access, the common name on that certificate has to be the URL by which users are going to access it to get a secure communication channel created. For example, www.arcgis.com, it may actually be the real server name. This is some slides I stole from a colleague, so it's got his server in there. So it could be a full, the real computer name or a DNS alias. But what if your public key, the common name, doesn't match the DNS alias or the server name? Well, what happens is when you try to access something like that, a self-signed certificate, or if the URLs don't match, you've probably seen this, right? Chrome, Firefox, IE, they all give you a variety of different, hey, you're going to something untrusted, are you really sure? All right, so these are situations where there's a problem with the certificate, the URLs don't match, maybe the certificate has expired at this point. There's a number of reasons why you might get this. The browser's trying to help you out a little bit. What happens if your system has multiple DNS names? What can you do about that? Well, certificates also allow you to have wildcards, which ArcGIS Enterprise fully supports. So you can say, hey, anything that's star.arcgis.com that's coming to me, that's okay. That's a valid certificate. Something else you can do along with that in the certificate world is have subject alternate names. So not only can you have a wildcard, but you can say, hey, this certificate also will be good for www.arcgis.com, greg.arcgis.com, bill.arcgis.com. So you can give it multiple DNS aliases, or what we call subject alternate names. All right. So basically the bundles of SSL. SSL is perhaps not the correct term to use these days. That was the original standard, SSL version 1, 2, and 3, all of which are basically obsolete now. The new standard is TLS. The current version is 1.2. Most web servers in the world today are probably using at least TLS, but some still do support some of the older versions. Certificate authorities are what are used to establish trust. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead for a moment. So when we talk about properly signed certificates, that means your server is going to have a certificate that is signed by some certificate authority. Okay? Who in here has heard of VeriSign, GoDaddy, Let's Encrypt? All of these are what we call certificate authorities. You give it a signing request, they do some magic to that thing and send you back a signed certificate. That certificate is then what you put on your web server or in your portal ArcGIS server if you need it there as well, to create a properly signed, secure communication channel. So basically, I just have some nice little graphics here where, hey, if the signed certificate, is both given to clients and servers in these scenarios. Okay? The way this works is there also may be intermediates. Just be aware. There's root certificate authorities, but there are commonly also what we call intermediate certificate authorities as well. In your environments, you may have some of these intermediate authorities. So basically what happens is when a client goes to access your server, the server says, oh, you're trying to access me over SSL. Here's my certificate. You decide if you trust it or not. Okay? That certificate comes back to the client. The client says, oh, okay, here's your certificate. It's been signed by GoDaddy. Is GoDaddy a trusted certificate authority within my system? If it is, then you get a nice trusted encryption because both the client and the server have been signed by and trust that same certificate authority, and you get a nice little green check and life is good. If for some reason you don't have that certificate authority trusted on your computer, you will get a web browser exception. Hey, this has been signed by somebody I don't know about. Do you really want to proceed? Okay. There's also the concept, just to be aware of, certificate revocation list. If your certificate, your signed certificate, which is a combination of a public and private key that work together, if that ever gets compromised, your private key ever gets compromised for some reason, you should immediately let your certificate authority know, my SSL certificate has been stolen, compromised, or something. You need to revoke it so it can't no longer be used, okay? So in these situations, certificate authorities also maintain certificate revocation list. And if that certificate shows up there when it goes to validate, it will say, oh, that's been revoked. And I think some web browsers now don't even let you proceed. You can't even say, hey, I want to go anyway. I think Chrome may block this scenario altogether now. These are just a few screens. I'm not going to, we're about out of time here of what these trusts look like on Fire. One key thing I want to make note, Internet Explorer and Chrome use the Windows certificate store for trust. Okay, so if I put GoDaddy and IE, for example, Chrome automatically uses that as also. If you are Firefox users, Firefox does not use the Windows certificate trust store. So when you import certificate authorities and you use Chrome and Firefox, you actually have to import it to the Firefox certificate store as well. So just be aware that Firefox is a little bit special in its case. Really, any scenario at the end of the day is you want that little green check mark showing up in your web browser. This is Chrome, IE, you get a nice little thing. If that's red there or even has an exclamation mark or some other things, then you know that something's not quite right with my scenario. I need to look into this a little bit more. Okay, so at the end of the day, that's really what you want your users to experience is a green, secure, trusted communication channel with your portal, especially in enterprise situations where sensitive information is potentially being passed around. All right, we are over our time. Please take our survey. A few other things. I'll highlight this because I'm giving this session. We're having a SSL kind of deep dive a little bit Thursday afternoon. If you're still around, feel free to come there. We can discuss some things in more detail. But if you got some questions, come on up and we'll try to answer them for you. Thank you.